The billionaire's private jet was more than a mode of travel. It was a symbol of perfection, precision, and pride. Sleek and silver, with engines that roared like thunder and interiors that gleamed with gold-trimmed elegance. It stood as a testament to everything he had achieved in his lifetime. But that morning, as the sun rose over the private runway of his estate, the jet sat motionless, surrounded by a team of the world's best engineers, each wearing the same expression of confusion and quiet panic. The engines refused to start, the diagnostics returned unreadable errors, and every system that should have responded perfectly remained stubbornly unresponsive. For a man used to instant solutions, this mechanical rebellion was intolerable. He had flown in from Dubai the night before and was scheduled to leave for Geneva at dawn to finalize a billion-dollar acquisition. But now the jet, his most prized asset, was grounded, mocking him with its silence. The hangar buzzed with activity as technicians scurried around, tools clattering, wires being checked and rechecked, software systems rebooted endlessly. Each minute that passed chipped away at his patience. He stood there, tall and imposing in his tailored navy suit, his eyes like cold steel, watching as his experts failed one after another. One of the engineers wiped sweat from his forehead, hesitating before approaching him. "Sir, we've run every test. The computer isn't responding to the onboard network." It's like he paused, searching for the right words, like something inside is deliberately blocking communication. The billionaire's jaw tightened. "So fix it," he snapped, his voice echoing in the hangar. But the truth was clear in everyone's eyes. No one knew how. They had tried replacing components, resetting circuits, even consulting the jet manufacturer through a secure line, but the issue remained unsolved. For the first time, the billionaire's empire of certainty felt fragile. He turned away from the chaos, walking toward the large glass wall overlooking the runway. Beyond the sleek hangar doors, a group of onlookers stood behind the security fence, watching the commotion. Most were airport staff or curious locals who had come to see the spectacle of a billionaire's malfunctioning luxury. But among them sat a thin young girl, her clothes dusty and torn, her dark hair tied back loosely, eyes following every movement inside with quiet intensity. She had been there since dawn, sitting on an overturned crate, hugging her knees against the morning chill. The guards had tried to move her once, but she had begged softly to stay, promising she wouldn't interfere. Something about her gaze, sharp, intelligent, unyielding, had made them let her be. Inside, the tension thickened. The billionaire's chief engineer, a man with decades of aviation experience, finally approached. "Sir, we may need to bring in a specialist from the manufacturer. The earliest they can arrive is in 12 hours. 12 hours. The billionaire's voice was low but dangerous. "Do you know how much I lose in 12 hours? His hand slammed against the console. "I hired the best, and yet not one of you can fix a jet." No one responded. The silence in the hangar grew heavy. The hum of machines filled the air as the billionaire's frustration burned deeper. He had built empires, crushed competitors, solved problems with money and intellect. Yet here, in his own domain, he stood powerless before a machine that refused to obey. Outside, the girl shifted slightly, her eyes narrowing. She had seen the error lights on the diagnostic panel when the hangar doors briefly opened. The flickering pattern was something she recognized not from luxury aircraft manuals or expensive schooling, but from scavenged circuits she used to repair in her makeshift shelter near the old airstrip. She had spent years collecting broken electronics, fixing them for food or a few dollars. Her father, once an aircraft mechanic before losing everything, had taught her the language of machines when she was small. To her, the pattern of blinking lights on that billion-dollar jet wasn't random. It was a signal, a call for help that no one else seemed to hear. As the engineers argued, she stood up, her thin frame trembling slightly in the cool wind. She walked closer to the fence, her voice soft but clear. "I can fix it." The guards turned, startled. One frowned, ready to wave her off. "Hey kid, move along. This isn't your place." She didn't move. "Please, I know what's wrong with it." The billionaire, halfway through another tirade, caught her voice faintly and turned. He saw her, a homeless girl in worn clothes, standing beyond the fence, and almost laughed at the absurdity. "Who let her stay there?" he muttered. "Get her out." But something in her expression stopped one of the engineers. She wasn't desperate or foolish. Her eyes were focused, confident, even calm. He hesitated and whispered to the billionaire, "Sir, maybe let her speak. We've tried everything else." The billionaire stared at him in disbelief, then looked back at the girl. "You think a street child can fix what my team of engineers can't?" The girl nodded once, unwavering. "I've seen that kind of failure before. It's not the systems, it's the feedback line in the auxiliary control. It loops itself when the backup power relay misreads a signal. You're looking in the wrong place." The hangar fell silent again. Some of the engineers exchanged uncertain glances. The terms she used weren't random guesses. The chief engineer frowned, pulling up the schematic on his tablet, tracing her words in his mind. "The feedback line," he murmured, scrolling quickly. "That would explain the cascade errors we've been getting." The billionaire's skepticism wavered for the first time. He studied her face, then finally motioned to the guards. "Let her in." A murmur spread through the crew as the gates opened. The girl stepped inside slowly, her bare feet quiet on the polished floor. She walked toward the jet with a mix of awe and familiarity, as if she were greeting an old friend. The billionaire watched as she climbed the small ladder and disappeared into the cockpit, her small hands moving over the panels with ease. Minutes passed. The engineers waited anxiously, whispering among themselves. Then, a soft whir echoed from the jet. One by one, the control lights flickered back to life. The engines hummed faintly, then roared awake with a power that vibrated through the hangar floor. Gasps filled the air. The girl stepped out, her face lit by the orange glow of the running engines. Her expression calm. The billionaire didn't speak. For the first time in years, he was silent not because he was angry, but because he didn't understand how someone like her, someone who owned nothing, could do what his wealth could not. The sound of the engines filled the space like a living heartbeat, mocking the arrogance of the world's most powerful man, and whispering a truth he had long forgotten, that brilliance, like worth, could rise from anywhere, even from the forgotten corners of the streets. The hangar was still vibrating from the tension that had filled it for hours, the air thick with frustration and failure. Engineers had come and gone, tools scattered across polished floors, laptops blinking endlessly as systems refused to respond. The billionaire's jet, the crown jewel of his fleet, remained lifeless despite every ounce of expertise thrown at it. The man himself stood like a shadow at the center of it all, a figure accustomed to command and obedience, now watching his empire's pride rendered powerless. Around him, people whispered, checked readings, and avoided his gaze, knowing that every second lost was another drop of fuel to his anger. Then, amidst the hum of machinery and the low murmur of defeat, a soft voice rose from outside, breaking through the noise with quiet certainty. "Let me try." Heads turned. The voice was unexpected, almost unreal in its gentleness. Through the hangar doors, under the gray light of the afternoon, stood a young black girl, thin, barefoot, her clothes torn and smudged with dust. Her eyes, though weary, held a sharpness that no one could miss. Security moved toward her instantly, ready to push her away, but she didn't flinch. She looked past them, straight toward the jet, her gaze unwavering. "Please," she said again. "I think I know what's wrong." The billionaire's first instinct was disbelief. To him, she looked like she barely belonged within sight of his aircraft, let alone near its complex systems. He scoffed under his breath, turning away, but one of the senior engineers hesitated. There was something unusual about the way the girl spoke, not in arrogance, but in quiet conviction, as though she was certain she had seen the problem. "Sir," the engineer began cautiously, "maybe we should hear her out. She might have noticed something." The billionaire turned his cold eyes on him. "Are you suggesting a homeless child knows more than my entire engineering team?" "No, sir," the man replied carefully, "but we're out of options. Nothing we've tried has worked." The billionaire exhaled sharply, then gestured with impatience. "Fine. Let's see what miracle she thinks she can perform." The guards reluctantly stepped aside. The girl walked forward slowly, the click of her small steps echoing across the vast hangar. Every eye followed her. She stopped near the jet, her gaze running over its body, tracing the lines of the metal as if she could sense the machine's pain. She placed a hand gently on the fuselage, almost reverently, before looking back at the crowd. "It's not a mechanical failure," she said softly. "It's the secondary feedback relay. You've been restarting it too fast, so it keeps looping and locking the main control." Her words drew frowns and murmurs. The chief technician immediately brought up the schematic on his tablet, his fingers moving quickly over the diagram. He froze. "She's describing the relay error we saw in the diagnostics this morning. But how would she know that?" The girl didn't answer the question. She was already climbing up the short ladder toward the cockpit, pausing only to glance at the billionaire for silent permission. He didn't speak, but his nod was enough. Inside the jet, her movements were precise, methodical, like someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Her fingers danced across the panels, pressing buttons in a deliberate rhythm. "You all kept resetting the primary system," she said, her voice echoing faintly. "That forced the sensors to read a false current. You have to disconnect the backup manually first." For a few tense seconds, no one breathed. Then, the cockpit lights flickered. The soft hum of power began to build, growing louder as the system came alive. The girl adjusted a final switch, and suddenly the full power of the jet roared to life. The massive engines trembled, stabilizing perfectly as the diagnostics flashed green. The billionaire's jaw tightened, his disbelief giving way to something he hadn't felt in years: humility. The crew erupted into a mix of applause and stunned laughter. Some couldn't stop staring at her. This young girl who had walked in from the streets and done what they, with all their degrees in technology, could not. The billionaire stepped closer to the cockpit, his expensive shoes clicking against the floor. "Who taught you that?" he asked, his tone softer now, almost wary. She looked at him with steady eyes. "My dad," she said quietly. "He used to work on jets like this before we lost everything. I used to watch him fix things when no one else could." Her voice carried no bitterness, only calm truth. He said, "Machines speak if you listen long enough." The billionaire didn't reply immediately. He studied her, this girl who had appeared out of nowhere and solved the There was oil smeared on her fingers, Dirt streaked across her arms, but her eyes glowed with the quiet fire of intelligence. She didn't look proud or expectant, just relieved, as though she had done what needed to be done, and nothing more. The engineers crowded around the cockpit, checking the systems and confirming the fix. "Everything's operational," one of them reported, disbelief still lingering in his voice. "Completely stable." The billionaire turned back to the girl. "What's your name?" "Alani," she said simply. He nodded slowly, the name etching itself into his mind. For a long moment, he said nothing, watching her as the sound of the jet filled the hangar like a living heartbeat. Around them, people whispered, phones clicked, and even the guards looked unsure of what they had just witnessed. It wasn't just the jet that had been repaired, it was something deeper, something invisible. The billionaire, who had built his fortune on control and mastery, had been forced to see brilliance from a place he'd never looked before. The girl, standing barefoot in front of a machine worth more than she could ever imagine, had reminded everyone present that genius didn't wear wealth. It carried instinct. She stepped back from the jet, her gaze lingering on its shining surface. The billionaire's assistant approached her, a mixture of awe and hesitation in his voice. "How did you even know to look there?" She smiled faintly. "Because when you have nothing, you learn to see everything." The billionaire looked away, his mind turning over her words. He had spent his life surrounded by experts, people who measured intelligence by degrees and achievements, yet this girl had walked out of nowhere, guided only by memory and intuition, and succeeded where all others had failed. For a man who thought he understood the world, it was an awakening he hadn't expected. The noise in the hangar faded into the background as his thoughts deepened. He remembered the arrogance in his voice when he had dismissed her moments earlier. How easily he had judged her by what she looked like, not what she knew. And now, staring at her, he saw the quiet defiance of someone who had survived long after life had given up on her. The girl looked toward the open hangar doors, where the afternoon light spilled in, bright and warm. She didn't wait for praise or reward. To her, the act of fixing the machine was enough. It was proof that even in a world that overlooked her, she still had value, perhaps more than any of them realized. The billionaire watched as she turned to leave, unsure of what to say. His empire was built on money, but in that moment, it felt meaningless compared to what she had just shown him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the most capable person in the room. He felt like a student, standing before a teacher disguised as a child who had nothing but knowledge, instinct, and a quiet belief that even broken things could work again, if given the right touch. The roar of the engines faded into a deep, rhythmic hum, filling the hangar with a sound that seemed to echo beyond machinery, a sound that carried humility, awe, and the weight of a moment no one expected. The billionaire stood motionless, his reflection shimmering faintly on the polished metal of the revived jet. Just minutes ago, he had been a man defined by control, certain that power came from wealth and command. But now, as he looked at the young homeless black girl standing quietly near the landing gear, her eyes cast down and her hands still marked with oil, he felt something shifting inside him, something uncomfortable, yet illuminating. She had done what his experts couldn't. She had solved a mystery that millions of dollars, advanced diagnostics, and technical mastery had failed to unravel. And she had done it without arrogance, without expectation, without fear. He had seen many kinds of intelligence in his lifetime, strategic, mechanical, but what she possessed was something deeper. It wasn't just knowledge. It was instinct, empathy, a kind of communion with the machine that transcended logic. When she said she could fix it, there had been no hesitation, no false confidence. Her voice had been calm, like someone speaking a truth too simple to doubt. Now, standing before her, the billionaire struggled to reconcile everything he believed about status, brilliance, and value. The engineers had retreated to a respectful distance, murmuring quietly as they checked the systems that now worked flawlessly. They threw her occasional glances, admiration mixed with disbelief. The guards who had once dismissed her now stood awkwardly, unsure whether to meet her eyes or look away. The billionaire walked toward her slowly, each step deliberate, as though afraid the moment would vanish if he moved too fast. When he finally stopped in front of her, she lifted her gaze, unafraid but curious. "What did you see?" he asked quietly. "That no one else could." Her voice was soft but sure. "Machines talk," she said. "Not with words, but with patterns. Most people just see problems they try to force the machine to obey. But if you listen, it tells you what it needs." He studied her, trying to grasp the simplicity of her answer. For years his life had been built on the idea that problems were to be conquered, not understood. He had built companies by outsmarting, outspending, and outmaneuvering others. But this girl, who had nothing but a sharp mind and worn clothes, had just shown him that sometimes understanding was greater than control. "You fixed something none of my people could," he said after a pause. "Do you know what that means?" She shrugged slightly, her hands clasped together. "It means your plane can fly again." Her answer struck him harder than he expected. There was no pride in it, no hunger for recognition. To her, the act of fixing something broken was not about status, it was about restoration, about making things work because that was what she knew how to do. He had lived his life surrounded by people who sought reward for every effort, who measured worth by compensation. She stood before him, asking for nothing. He found himself wondering about her story. where she had learned such precision, how she had come to be outside his hangar that morning, what kind of life had shaped her into someone capable of brilliance without bitterness. You said your father worked on planes? He asked. She nodded. Before he got sick? Before we lost our home? He used to take me to the old airfield and show me how things worked. Said I had good ears, that I could hear when machines were hurting. Her voice was steady, but there was a shadow behind it. After he passed, I tried to keep fixing things. Old radios, bikes, anything people threw away. I like giving broken things another chance. The billionaire's throat tightened slightly. He had seen poverty from a distance, from boardrooms and reports, as a statistic, a challenge to solve with philanthropy and figures. But standing before her, he realized how detached that perspective had been. Poverty wasn't just lack of money, it was the world turning its eyes away from people like her, people whose worth couldn't be measured by what they owned. He looked at the jet behind him, its smooth metallic body gleaming under the fluorescent lights. To him, it had always symbolized freedom, luxury, dominance. To her, it had simply been another broken thing waiting to be heard. And now that it lived again, it seemed almost to mock his former arrogance. Around them, the engineers finished their tests and confirmed the repair. The chief technician approached the billionaire quietly. Sir, everything's fully operational. She was right about the relay issue. The billionaire nodded without taking his eyes off the girl. I know, he said softly. Then, after a pause, she saw what none of us did. The technician gave a respectful nod before stepping back. Understanding that something larger than a repair had just taken place, the billionaire turned again to the girl. Do you have somewhere to stay? Her eyes flickered briefly to the hangar doors, where the evening light began to fade. Not really, she said after a moment. Sometimes the shelter lets me sleep inside. Sometimes they're full. He was silent for a moment. The question that came next surprised even him. Would you like a job? Her eyes widened slightly, unsure if she'd heard correctly. A job? Yes, he said. With my aviation team, we could use someone who listens the way you do. The girl looked uncertain, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. You'd really let me work here? He nodded. If you want to. The silence stretched between them. But this time, it wasn't heavy, it was alive. Filled with something new, something that felt like respect. She finally nodded, a small, hesitant smile forming on her lips. That moment, fragile and wordless, carried more weight than any deal he had ever made. For the first time, the billionaire saw what real wealth meant, not money, but the ability to see potential where others saw nothing. The girl had walked into his world and revealed its blindness. Not by shouting, not by demanding, but by simply showing truth through action. Later, as the hangar emptied and the last of the light faded, he stood by the window watching her walk across the runway. Her figure small against the vastness of the sky. The engines of the jet purred softly in the background, alive and obedient once more. But his thoughts were elsewhere. He thought about how easy it was to mistake privilege for intelligence. How often brilliance went unnoticed because it came dressed in poverty, and how, in that single afternoon, a stranger had taught him more about humility and human worth than all his years of success. He realized that the jet wasn't the only thing that had been fixed that day. Something inside him, something rusted and rigid, had been repaired too. The sound of the girl's voice, calm and unwavering, echoed in his mind. Machines talk. You just have to listen. And as he stared at the horizon where the sky met the earth, he knew those words weren't just about machines, they were about people, about life, about the quiet wisdom that existed in places he had never cared to look. For the first time in a long while, the billionaire felt small, and in that smallness, he found something close to peace.